You're listening to Breakpoint this week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian perspective. Today we're going to talk about the opening ceremonies at the Olympics and how Christians should approach art. We're also going to talk about men in women's sports and the injection of questions about so-called gender and how we approach physical activity. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Please stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Bear, alongside John Stonestreet. John, have you ever had Olympic aspirations?
Not serious ones.
But if you had to pick a sport, what would it be?
Really? You don't know that
Speed
after
walking?
all these years?
Well, basketball. Basketball's boring.
Yeah.
Pick a more exciting one.
Yeah, that'd be it.
Okay.
I might be like that old guy
gymnast
who just picked up pistol shooting. Did you see that story? That's
No,
a pretty great
but
story out of the Olympics. No, this is a Turkey. He won the silver, and he picked it up. I mean, it's a sad story. It has to do with his wife left him, and he, this was a way of kind of dealing with that. And I don't know. There's this whole story, but the funny part is everybody that was in the competition was all decked out, and he showed up like in an untucked shirt and just glasses and just won a silver. And he's only been doing it for a couple years.
That's
so
hardcore. Although there's something, I'm not sure about this. You're saying he picked up shooting as a hobby after his wife left him? I don't like
that part does sound a little bit, but it's true. I mean, it's the story. It's a funny story.
There's a couple there's a handful of Olympic competitions now that are like that, where it's just like, it's so new. Did you know that there's speed climbing this year? I heard the story on The World and Everything in it. It's like climbing a rock climbing wall, but how fast can you do it? And they do it under 10 seconds or whatever.
And here's the headline from NBC. With one hand in his pants pocket, the 51-year-old shot his way to second place, marking a historic moment.
What country is he from, you said?
Turkey.
That's awesome. Good for him. Well, John, there's still hope for you then, man. You could pick something. Well, let's talk about the Olympics. That's the first thing I wanted to talk with you about today, because obviously this has been big news this week after the opening ceremonies. So the Olympics are taking place in Paris, and the opening ceremonies are usually, the ones I remember even from when I was a kid were just kind of, you bring the torch up and it's all the athletes in their gear and people are waving their flags of their home countries and we're all excited to start the competition. And this was some kind of artistic tableau. I'm putting this all in scare quotes because I'm not exactly sure what it was. But it was very strange and a bit disturbing to watch. It was some kind of like pageant or modern dance. I don't even know how you would classify this thing. But one of the most controversial parts of it was, of course, this tableau that seemed to depict The Last Supper, the painting by Da Vinci, and was pretty obviously depicting that. But every character in this version was a drag queen, so a man dressed up like an exaggeratedly promiscuous woman. And it was pretty grotesque. And then a lot of the other tableaus in this event were very sexual and graphic and disturbing to watch. Of course, they had Marie Antoinette standing with her head in her hands and the head is talking. I guess it was supposed to be a nod to sort of the French Revolution and French identity and freedom and enlightenment. And it was just very, very weird. I'm very glad that we did not turn it on to watch with the kids, because I think if we had been home, I would have, assuming that it would be what I described before, but it was not that.
Yeah, it's interesting how these opening ceremonies have become kind of more ways of advancing either kind of national or cultural histories or, even more agendas. I think the Beijing Olympics was an example of this, where there was a real need for the Chinese Communist Party to portray to the world like, hey, we're awesome. And the spectacle was unbelievable. But there's that one scene from that opening ceremonies where you had 2008 drummers drumming exactly at the same time. And if you think, man, there is there's no room for creativity, there's only room to do what the state tells you to do, you couldn't have communicated it better than the opening ceremonies in Beijing did then. France is certainly not the first one, and this was a first in the sense that it wasn't done within a stadium setting. Imagine practicing for this thing over the course of probably years and having to kind of, block and tackle the various elements of it in order to produce it. But this was a show, basically a journey down a river, down the middle of Paris. Super creative, and really remarkable. And you're talking about a really old city with with a much better known history, to some degree, than some of the other nations that have hosted it. And so there was a lot of things I think that was, really, creative and innovative about it. And then there was this layer of decadence that ended up being communicated. And I use that word really carefully. I think there's a lot of words that can be used to describe these opening ceremonies. One was satanic, because of the Marie Antoinette piece and the mockery of the Last Supper. Obviously there's been a lot of debate, and apparently the organizers can't even decide whether or not it was about the Lord's Supper or not. About Da Vinci's painting. They said it was, and they said it wasn't. The director, named that aspect of the opening ceremonies, used a play on words, to describe, and basically identified it as a reference to the Lord's Supper, but then said it wasn't. And then there was, the case being made that it was really about a celebration of a scene from Greek mythology and a Greek god. And honestly, the back and forth I found to be super unconvincing. I point everyone, and I'll go ahead and toss my recommendation for the week out right now, which is a video from an artist named Jonathan Pageau. He's an Orthodox iconographer, and I first came across his work at the art conference in London. He was featured on a panel and talked about the idea of beauty and culture and in art, and he did a pretty thorough, damning analysis, let's put it that way, of the opening ceremonies, and particularly the backpedaling and the whataboutisms and the justifications that are being used to say, no, this really wasn't, that bad. Even if it's true, which I find Pageau's analysis very compelling, that no question that this was actually a reference to the Da Vinci painting. It was known up front. And there was a statement being made. Even if it's true, though, that it wasn't, I think the word satanic still applies, because Satan doesn't usually just operate with the goal of creeping people out and making things, weird and spooky. I think we've reduced Satanism down to that. We've had a lot of kind of satanic references in pop culture over the last couple of years. We've talked about it a lot on Breakpoint, from Sam Smith to his performance at the Grammys and some others. Mm-hmm. And it always comes across as kind of a celebration of the creepy. Certainly Halloween celebrations move more and more in that direction over the years. But if you actually look at the work of the enemy in Holy Scripture, it is not a worship of Satan that's being, described here. It's the enemy trying to get us to worship ourselves. And that's the very first lie in the garden. You're going to be like God. That is exactly what this whole performance was about. Mm-hmm. This was a celebration of a French idea of freedom. And the thing about the French Revolution and its idea of liberty was that it was in stark contrast to the American Revolution. And the idea, you can kind of compare the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and all that is implied by that, specifically identifying that those things were given to us by our Creator, right. And contrast that to the liberty, fraternity, and equality vision that was driven by a direct rejection of religion. Remember, the famous line from, Benjamin Franklin that, this republic that they had come up with was something that would have to be kept. John Adams said that, this was a vision for a moral people and it won't work for anybody else. That was never any language of that around the French Revolution. The French Revolution was way more about a freedom from. In a commentary this week, in fact, I thought of this as soon as I saw these clips from the opening ceremony. My mind immediately went to this epic quote from Denis Diderot, who was the editor of the very first encyclopedia. And he had to be one of the most high capacity individuals of all time if you look at the project that he spearheaded. But he famously said that man would never be free until the last king was strangled by the entrails of the last priest. Pretty graphic quote, but it just tells you exactly what we were seeing at these opening ceremonies. Basically, this idea that religion needed to be scorned, mocked, and rejected, and the state needed to be scorned, mocked, and rejected, and that freedom then takes the form of sexual freedom. And I think that word satanic then absolutely applies, because this is a satanic view of freedom. It's a view of freedom that puts the will of the self over and above and detached from anything that tradition or that outside constraint puts on you. It's a wrong definition of freedom. That definition of freedom always leads to further oppression. By the way, so did the French Revolution. The French Revolution didn't work. The French Revolution was a disaster. This is if you want a historical example of, Jesus' parable where he's like, you cast a demon out and 7 more come and move in. It's the French Revolution. It's French history. So the whole portrayal, as creative and big as it was in the opening ceremonies, was truncated. It didn't tell the whole story. It didn't tell about the oppression that came later. And that sort of oppression is inevitable when people can't govern themselves. And when people go down that sort of libertine view of freedom, they cease being able to govern themselves. Like this is all like historical math. It's not magic. It's not, some sort of, fairy tale. This is the way reality works, because there is a reality that works itself out in human history. And all of this is such a stark example.
Yeah.
But I also think that word, I want to go back to the word I threw out earlier, which is decadence. And so this is a word that really gets introduced into this conversation from Jacques Barzun, who wrote about a decadent society. It was recovered, and I felt like this book got overlooked, and it was really, really good. Ross Douthat, the kind of the sole token conservative at the New York Times, writes about that the West has entered a stage of decadence. Now, we use the word decadence to talk about chocolate or to talk about dessert, right? We might talk about a lifestyle that's decadent, which is one that just basically is very wealthy and just has a whole bunch of fun stuff to play with.
I picture lots of like furs and carpets of like bear skins and stuff. That feels
so that's
very
decadence in the 70s, but bringing it up to the modern day, decadence really is reflected in a society that doesn't do anything new. It's tired. So creativity gets stifled because there's a lack of imagination. And before the lockdowns of 2020, I was with my daughter, I believe, in New York City. We were walking around the Broadway, and it hit me. It hit me again this past year when I was in London, walking through the theater district. There's no new ideas there. Every single play, I would say every single, there's like 2 or 3 exceptions. The vast majority of the plays are theatrical versions of movies that were already bad back in the 80s and 90s when they came out.
Or it's Joan of Arc reimagined as a man.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Is that you take the exact same storyline and then reimagine the hero according to intersectionality. This would be what Ross Douthat argues in his book on Western decadence, is that we haven't really done anything new in decades. What we've done is tried to take the things we already have done and make them quicker or easier or prettier. So in other words, there's nothing fundamentally different about a better, faster iPhone, right? So what you're doing is the exact same thing. People could argue that the smartphone was a kind of an innovation. He argues that it's not in the book, but really since then we don't have anything, and we don't have anything other than the smartphone. It's not like going to the moon was in the 1960s, the space race. We don't have anything that's just fundamentally different. I saw these clips, and the fact that the Olympic Committee would allow this to go forward that the organizing committee of the Paris Olympics would think this is a good idea tells you an awful lot. Because this is just like basically a really expensive, huge version of bad theater that you get in New York City, where essentially, what do? You take something that's there like religion and you mock it again. You take history and you mock it. It's decadence. You see what I mean? Like it's like there was nothing new here. And by the way, it should tell everyone that this is sexual freedom takes you to decadence. And what I mean by sexual freedom is not true freedom, but the way we talk about sexual freedom since the sexual revolution, which is like, don't tell me what to do. I can do whatever I want. I can even be whoever I want. Boys can be girls. Girls can be boys. And of course, that has become a sub storyline in this Olympics because of the boxing match, which we need to talk about as well. This is like the epic event that happens every 4 years. And we got a tired drag show for the opening ceremonies. Yeah. It was just bigger and better. So my point is it's decadence. Yeah. And there's nothing new. There was nothing creative. There was nothing epic about it. And that's what we were sold. That's what we were told. All the potential was there with this journey down, French history and the Seine River. But what did we get? We got basically, it's fascinating to me. Sexual freedom always takes this form. A tired, uncreative, mocking of religion and God. And you have to, right? Because you have to rail against the body. You have to rail against creation. You have to rail against goodness. And you don't actually portray anything great. It just becomes this kind of, rage against the machine sort of thing. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think the two words are satanic and decadent. And I don't think it matters one bit whether or not this was actually a parody of the Last Supper or not, in terms of this opening ceremony earning both of those words, those titles. Sure.
So a couple things I find interesting about this as well. The first is I still don't understand why the French would celebrate or be proud of at all anything relating to the French Revolution. You brought this up. But when I was in Paris last fall, we went over to there's the monument where the Bastille prison stood. And they celebrate Bastille Day. They call it their Independence Day. That is wild to me. I don't know why you would own it. I think that's one of the darkest moments in all of French history. And they celebrate it. I think the only way you can get away with that, even like in your own conscience, is to pretend it was about something else. But I would be fascinated to read, like, someone who considers the French Revolution to be a moment of great national pride as a French person. I want to read their manifesto on how they do that math, because that makes zero sense to me. It, like you said, it just absolutely deteriorated into neighbor against neighbor bloodbath, men, women, children, constant beheadings.
Yeah. Isn't the only way that that's a good story is if you already have decided who the bad guys are?
Because
it was the killing of all the traditional,
the nobility, but they didn't defeat the bad guys. The end of the French Revolution was Napoleon.
Right, and that's true. That's a good point. Like, it's kind of like every other example of this. If you think about the killing fields of Cambodia, right? Like, we're taking people with eyeglasses and advanced degrees and killing them, so everybody's equal. Everybody looks at that and says that's a horrific sort of event. When a country kind of devolves into that sort of bloodshed. But I think the narrative that has gone forward is that, look, this was the monarchy and, the Catholic Church was oppressing France.
Marie Antoinette had too much money and people were hungry. Yeah. There are obviously legitimate complaints. There was a lot of decadence among the nobility, but this is not a moment to be proud of. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think the only way you can do it is by rewriting history and pretending that it was about something it wasn't about, or that it accomplished something it didn't accomplish. But I think the other thing that's stuck out to me about the drag performance, and I agree with you, it's boring. Like, this stuff is just boring at this point. It's not subversive. If it's what the subversive thing to do, it would be to, like, hold a worship service. That would be the most subversive thing you could possibly do at an Olympics opening ceremony. And I'm not lobbying for that. I'm just pointing out the truth of the matter. But the thing that I took away from it is, man, if you don't take Christ seriously, you should know that everybody else does. People who hate Christians, people who think or pretend to think that Christianity is stupid or old or backwards or oppressive, they take it very seriously. This had a real tinge of like, why are you so obsessed with Jesus to it? You know, you guys pretend that the church is irrelevant and that, you know, we all know it's untrue, and the truth claims of Christianity about our bodies and sex and the world and life, those are irrelevant and backwards, and you're a crazy weirdo if you believe them, and nobody cares about that stuff. Then you watch these ceremonies and you're like, man, it feels like of the two of us, you guys are the ones that can't let this go. Like it's obsessive.
Tom Holland had a great response on this, because somebody said this whole thing just proves Tom Holland was right. And he tweeted, I was so right. You know, because really, I mean, you kind of wonder, you know, when you walk down Broadway these days or in the theater district of London, it's like, this place what would we be doing if there weren't all these bad movies in the 80s? Like if they didn't have this stuff to work with. And the same thing emerged there in the opening ceremonies. It's like, what would you guys do if you didn't Notre Dame wasn't right here? And the stark contrast between the beauty of this place and the sense of national loss when it burned versus
this weird thing,
this spectacle.
That was the other part of it that I wanted to encourage people to lean into. We've talked about this before, but like, you can't force yourself to think something is beautiful that is hideously ugly. And I truly believe that 99% of the world, people who are sober-minded and honest thinkers, when you see things like drag performances, you know that that's ugliness. You have the feeling when they put on these spectacles and they spend all this money and they do all this preparation and all this supposedly creative work, that they're saying to you, look at this, and you think this is beautiful. You think this is cool. You think this is special and artistic, don't you? And everyone doesn't. But people are going to go along to get along and say, yeah, wasn't that cool? Or I enjoyed that or whatever. And I truly believe, especially the older I get, you can't change. I mean, you can't force yourself to think something's beautiful that isn't. And a man dressed as a woman who is being outrageously sexual on a huge public scale, like a spectacle, is just never going to be beautiful. And you can't
and
make
painted
it beautiful.
Blue. You forgot the and painted blue part.
Lord, it was just, if you get a feeling of grossness in the pit of your stomach, you're not a bad, but that's natural, and that's not going to go away. You can't force that out of a culture, because there is such a thing as truth.
You know, I also think the other part of the truncated history that probably should be brought up is, even if let's say, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt to the incredible back and forth about whether or not this was intended to, parody the Lord's Supper painting or not. Isn't the story of Paris that this was kind of a celebration of kind of the Greek. Isn't the whole story of the West and the story of Paris is that Christianity beat mythology? You know, I mean, in other words, like that's where it's really come out. And, Christianity won that. It's not even close. And, oh, by the way, with that came freedom for children, not sexualization of children.
And women.
And there was a little bit of that quiet part said out loud that they had the child standing right there in the middle of this, decadence. And then, of course, there was the nudity that, came through. I'm trying to say that I'm trying to not describe it, but also I'm not trying to make a pun here, guys. That's what I'm trying to say. But it was just, it's just like, and of course, I don't believe for a second that was accidental. You're just like, there was not just kind of that inherent sense of beauty that you're talking about, although I agree with that. I do think culture is really good at stamping out beauty, but there's something in us that can't be undone that God has created. So I think even if you take a particularly kind of violent or vile civilization, where things have really devolved into bloodlust and abuse, that when something beautiful is shown, it speaks to something deep inside, right? And you can't fully suppress. Humans are really good at suppressing, Romans 1 says, but you can never fully suppress the image of God or the eternity put in our hearts or the yearning that we have for what's good and true and beautiful. There is this way that this story is just was so poorly told. And there's so much more to it. And it led to such liberation. Paganism was not like this super free thing that Christianity came and oppressed. Paganism was terrible for women, for children. And Christianity comes and says, look, men, you're stronger than these women, but these women are made in the image of God too. You can treat these children as property, but they're not. And suddenly this is where true liberation emerged. And, to tell the story differently is just irresponsible. It's just not true.
Yeah. So John, we've been talking about the opening ceremonies at the Olympics, and one of the comparisons that has come up a lot with good reason is, the comparison to, for example, the Charlie Hebdo, magazine based in Paris that several years ago put out a satirical cartoon depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and then there was, some Islamic terrorists basically went into the magazine headquarters and killed several people. There was a shooting, or a stabbing, I believe. Sorry. And so one of the things people have pointed out, obviously, because a lot of the French people or people online defending the decision to do the opening ceremonies like this, and particularly depicting the Last Supper in this kind of faux subversive way, is, well, that's what French culture is. We're subversive, we're edgy, we push the boundaries and stuff. And lots of people are obviously like, okay, do Islam next and we'll believe you. And obviously they won't, because it's dangerous. But here's my question. So we, I think rightly so, as Christians, we look at something like the Charlie Hebdo massacre, and it is a point of pride, and a point in the favor of the rationality of our belief system, that's not how Christians respond to being mocked. We're not so fragile as to think that we have to charge in and literally murder people if you say something wrong about Jesus, because the word of the Lord can withstand whatever criticism you throw his way. At the same time, like, how should that influence our response to something like this depiction of the Last Supper? Because I think it's understandable to be grossed out by it, even offended by it. But, I don't want to take it too lightly. But I also want to have the sort of intestinal fortitude to say, okay, sure, have your fun. You can poke fun. That's not really going to mess with my my faith or my confidence in my faith.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I do think that was the other subtext of all this, is not only the offense and even the outrage felt by an awful lot of Christians, and even, by the way, a lot of French people on the behalf of Christians who weren't Christians themselves, at least according to posts that we saw. But also then the other Christians who always kind of show up and lecture the Christians who got offended, and saying you shouldn't be offended, and you should never say anything, in self-defense, and you should never, we should never condemn any other culture. The answer is just to create other culture. I saw that response this morning. And by the way, Christians should absolutely be culture creators. But you cannot go through the scripture. You can't see what Paul did on Mars Hill. You can't see what he did even in appealing to his own, Roman citizenship. You can't see the sort of religious culture that Jesus directly critiqued, and say that there's no role to, we should only create, we should never critique. No, this is the thing. We're humans. We live in a cultural setting because humans are cultural creatures. Some culture needs to be created. Some culture needs to be critiqued. Some culture needs to be torn down because it's dangerous and damaging, for people. And so that's why I think, just doing the comparison with, we're better than the Muslims is not enough. I mean, of course, everyone immediately saw that for what it was. Yeah. You take the cheap shot, at the Christians. Even the guy who was behind it, the producer of this, talked a little bit about all the people that were there, from different nations that aren't free like we are, and celebrating freedom. And it's like, really? You're going to talk about, the real problem is that Republicans want to limit abortion access in America. No, the problem isn't that. The problem, the real problem is the history of Christianity you're talking about North Korea is there, and
Iran doesn't let women uncover their head, but sure.
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy was pretty obvious. But look, I kept thinking of a very interesting passage. It's one that we refer to a lot as we think about dealing with kind of pagan cultures, because it's one of the most kind of stark descriptions of Christians engaging a directly pagan culture. And that is Acts 17, when Paul goes to Athens. And Paul gets up and he talks about being deeply distressed, that where Luke talks about Paul was deeply distressed as the city was full of idols. If you look at John Stott, who's got a wonderful commentary on Acts, one of the best commentaries on Acts, he spends a little bit of time in that commentary on that word distressed. And it was not just like, oh, these people don't know Jesus, that's what bothers me. It was being distressed by the idolatry. The first thing that the Bible prohibits is not being engaging with unbelievers, or even being mean to somebody else, or less than, winsome to somebody else. Mm-hmm. It's idolatry. Mm-hmm. There is a sense in which Paul there, at least according to how John Stott understands what Luke is saying, and the word that's used specifically for distressed is angry, upset, outraged. Mm. And of course, let's remember what's happening. Now, when he gets a chance to speak to them, he does some pretty winsome, creative stuff in terms of talking about, hey, I see that you are very religious. Let's talk about religion. Let's talk about this thing about worshiping. And have you ever considered that unknown God? I know who he is. And he's actually the one that created all this. And this other stuff is just bogus. And you should know that, because, if there is a God that created everything, he certainly wouldn't live here, There's all this, really cool stuff that Paul does there. Remember that what he's referring to is an idolatry in Athens that ran really deep. Luke describes a little bit of that, where they love to do nothing more than sit around and talk about the latest ideas. And we know historically just how religious it was, where they had, this marketplace that the Romans had built for the city to do business, and the Athenians had filled it up with temples and altars and idols. And so they had to come in and build another marketplace there so that they could actually do business. But the idol worship was pornographic. Okay. It was violent. It was debased. It was terrible for children and women. There was elements of sacrifice of children, if not physically, then sexually. There was prostitution. Prostitution is, as it always is, oppressive to those that are involved, and also terrible for the wider culture in terms of breaking up homes and families. Like, this wasn't okay. Paul didn't go around, then like not being offended. It's okay to be offended at things that are offensive. Mm-hmm. We should do it out of love of God and love of neighbor. Mm-hmm. And I honestly get really, really tired of the lectures. Yeah. I get tired of the lectures of people saying, Christians shouldn't believe Christian things. Christians shouldn't actually hold seriously Christian morality. Mm-hmm. You should be angry, and it is possible to be angry without sin, when adults take a child to a hypersexualized drag show.
Mm-hmm.
That happened in my city in Colorado Springs. It made me mad. There were videos that came out of the Pride Parade. We talked about how Pride Month was largely muted. That's because Target and Bud Light lost so much money that everybody kind of stood down in the corporate world. But you went to the Pride Parade and there, you know, as you said, it is the worst stereotyping of women in a hypersexualized sort of way. Mm-hmm. And my wife and I talked about this. Our church is downtown. You walk out and people are taking their children to this. How can we be okay with that?
Yeah.
Now, do we be surprised? Is being mad the same thing as being holier than thou? No. That's what we often hear. We're sinners too. Yeah, we are sinners. And to not call something sin, and I think Rosaria Butterfield has said this really well, to not call something that is sin, basically robs someone of a chance of repentance. And repentance is the way that, you know, the starving man finds bread.
And if the reason we're not supposed to be offended is because we want to look winsome or not look fragile, supposedly, to people outside of the church. So ostensibly, the reason to not be offended is to make Christianity more attractive. What are the people openly mocking Christianity doing? Are they making Christianity more attractive?
Right. Now, I'm with Tom Holland. You remember that we keep coming back to this. It's a loaded reference now because it took on some political life over the last couple weeks, but we got to stay weird.
Yeah.
And I'm not referring, you know, to JD Vance, who was called weird. And then when you do the comparison, like who was in the Biden administration, you're like, really?
There's some weirdness here.
Our choice of weird. Yeah. This is where, you know, where I just wanted to nuance a little bit this idea that beauty, our sense of beauty doesn't go away, but it can be pretty actively suppressed.
Sure.
Where people stand up and say, this is what certainly our understanding of goodness is.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question, though, that is a little more practical. And that is when you watch something like the opening ceremonies, or even something like spiritually tinged horror movies, what does the Bible have to say about our, like the danger to Christians, to our hearts or minds of watching those things? My mom, when I was growing up, was just very, very careful about those things, not in a paranoid way or in an irrational way, but used to tell me, Maria, just don't open the door. You know, like why open the door to thoughts like that or to images like that? And I've gone through various points in my life where I think, well, we don't need to be that fragile. Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world, etc. At the same time, obviously, I'm shielding my kids from stuff that is grotesque and disgusting. But how careful do we need to be? Is that a real concern that if you watch something, it can come into you in a spiritual sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in the same way that you and I have spent so much time saying, you know, parents, don't give your, you know, 9-year-old a cell phone. You know, that's opening the door to all kinds of bad stuff. And I'm not just talking about the content, but actually the structure and the form and the way of thinking about other people and the way of thinking about themselves and so on. But you're talking about, I think, more of the creepy stuff. And it's funny because you said when you watch a super spiritually charged horror movie, I don't watch a whole lot of those for the record. So, you know, maybe you do, but I
went through a phase when I was in high school where I was trying to be cool and all the cool kids were doing it. And I'm telling you, it's been 20 years. And some of those images are still in my mind.
That's funny. I worked at a college, and there was a girl there, a young woman there at the college who was deathly afraid of clowns. And that was her phobia. I couldn't go to McDonald's because of a Ronald McDonald statue. Yeah. And it was because of it wasn't even like creepy. There was a terrible B-level movie called Killer Clowns from Outer Space. It's the most observably ridiculous thing. I've seen clips of it. It's just, yeah. But she wasn't scared at the time, but it created this long-term phobia for her. It's really funny. No, look, I think that the answer really has so much to do with taking a couple things seriously. Number one is that James clearly describes that certain things affect certain people different ways. You know, I remember talking with a guy. I won't mention his name, although he's a wonderful guy and a good friend.
Is it Tom Holland?
It's not Tom Holland. I wish he was a friend, but no, it's somebody else. But he just said, you know, I don't really struggle with lust. And I thought, wow, I don't know how to relate to that because, there was various ways, as James describes, that, he uses fishing language in his epistle to talk about how Satan tempts different people, how the enemy tempts different people based on what will lure them. It's like fishing lures is kind of the language there. And there is some specifics that people are attracted to different things in different ways: power, sex, wealth, fame, ease, decadence, things like that. And so I think we have to take that really, really seriously. So it's certainly not going to affect all people the same way. Yeah. There's also, I think, the more fundamental aspect of just maturity and growth. That's really the whole conversation around the eating of food sacrificed to idols, which was a big point of debate. And Paul's really clear, like, you know what? Not a big deal, because we know that those aren't even real gods, and we shouldn't even take them seriously. But if it's going to offend a younger, a weaker brother, you shouldn't do it.
Don't do it.
I think that is a powerful, lesson in terms of that not everybody's in the same place where, there's also a difference between self-selecting in to that sort of horror and not having a choice. There's an awful lot of people who are basically born into horror situations, born into cultures or families in which, there are just these kind of strongholds or everything falls apart. And you think about that and you think, well, we believe that the work of Christ is big enough to help restore the families and communities, say, for example, after the genocide in Rwanda. So certainly he can, put somebody back together again who got tempted and went way down, too far down the creepy pathway. But there is a difference between self-selecting in and not selecting in. And there's an idea of just prudence and wisdom and also stewardship, because, we only have so many minutes in a day. We only have so much attention. So I think that's at least a little bit behind what Paul means when he says, finally, brothers, focus in on what's true.
Think about what's good. Yeah.
And, I spoke for a group the other day, and we've talked a lot about the parable of the madman from Friedrich Nietzsche and how indicative and instructive it is. And look, Nietzsche was a, godless
madman,
God hater. Yeah. And yet I think that there's so much there that can be instructive about where we're at as a culture. And I remember the first time I really came across Nietzsche was a well-known Christian apologist who said he read Nietzsche for his devotions. And I never quite got that. I still don't quite get that. Pretty sure that's not a good idea for most people. Maybe it's true that if you read, if you have scripture memorized up one side, down the other, then you're going to read Nietzsche through the lens of scripture and you don't have to worry about it. I hope he at least tempered his Nietzsche reading with some Psalms or something, but I don't know. But he was in a completely different place than I was at the time than I am right now in terms of his knowledge and his commitment to the Lord. So I think you have to take all those things seriously.
Sure.
And then, this is what is so powerful about Jesus's words is that he takes sin and temptation and faithfulness from the outward to the inward. He backs it up into intent and motivation. And so then you got to go back and go, well, what's the motivation here? Why would I do this? And asking why would I do that and tying that why to worship is what Jesus did. And that's pretty powerful stuff.
That's really cool,
and at that point you are talking stewardship, and you only have so many minutes in a day. And
you could apply that to the intent of the artist or whoever created what you're considering to, if somebody does something like Nietzsche or whatever, and they're writing an honest exploration of philosophy, however misguided it might be, that's different than watching or listening to something that was set out from the very beginning to be mocking of Jesus. Right?
Listen, this is such an important point, and I know we probably don't have time for this, but I can't not go down this rabbit hole.
Let's have
because the most helpful thing that I've ever heard in terms of thinking about thinking about art and artistic expression. Two things. Number one is the shift in our postmodern world was the shift from art as communication to art as expression.
Okay. I get that.
Now that gets right to the heart of intent, right? In other words, is my goal to communicate something? You can go back, for example, to realism, sacred art. The idea behind all of that is there's a real world, and I'm going to communicate that real world to you. Whether that real world was, a realistic portrayal of a meadow or a realistic portrayal of the supernatural, there was this assumption that this was real, and I'm going to communicate that real world to you. And now walk in an art museum. You live in Ohio. Go to the Wexner Center at Ohio State. Tell me you've done this.
Well, every building in Ohio State has the name Wexner on it.
No, the Wexner Center for the Performing Arts, where they have stairs that don't go anywhere. And they have broken glass outside as landscaping.
You know who I saw the last time I went in there?
What?
You know what I saw last time I went in there? Max McLean.
Was he in there?
He was in there. He did a performance about C.S. Lewis, so maybe a little bit of redemption. But yeah.
Look, I took a group touring through there. It's a fascinating building, but you look at all of this and there's nothing to communicate. There's no real world.
Yeah.
So basically all you're left doing is basically communicating through artistic expression whatever you're feeling. So it's that inward turn that we've talked about that affects so many other things. It has affected art, and it has shifted art from being fundamentally about communication to fundamentally about expression. Yeah. So that's the first really helpful thing to think about. And clearly you can see that in the opening ceremony, where it purportedly was about communicating the history of French culture and French history, and it clearly never got to that. But the other thing is then how do we actually evaluate whether art is good or bad? And when you move it from communication to expression, you've got no ground to stand on. So if we remember, though, that it is fundamentally about communication, evaluating communication basically means there's three things to look at. Number one is the communicator. Number two is the message. And number three is the communicatee, or the one that receives the message. So every communication is evaluated on that. Now it could be, and this name came up to me this past week from a graduate of Hillsdale College who said, I had a wonderful teacher there. And I said, was it Michael Bauman? He goes, yes. And I was like, I worked with Michael Bauman for years at Summit Ministries in Australia, New Zealand, not Australia. And I owe this framework to Michael. He said, for communication to happen, all three of those things have to be on point, right? It could be that the communicator, the artist, or the messenger has fuzzy thinking, and he wants to tell you about a particular thing, but he's not really good at thinking about it. So what he communicates is really, really messy. It could be that and so because he's not clear, the message becomes not clear, and it's not clear to you in what you hear. It could be that the messenger is bad, so that the message is bad, but you as the receiver are really smart, and you're discerning in the biblical sense of the word. So you actually can read, because you've studied worldview, you know what he's actually intending, and you know what's wrong with the message that he's communicating, right? How many times did Jesus do this, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees? Here's what you're actually saying, and you don't even know it. It could be that the messenger is really good and the message is really good, but the viewer, the receiver, the messengee doesn't have any clue. This is, you're not sophisticated, you're not thoughtful, and you're just looking to be entertained. And so you're not discerning. And if you think about communication on those three levels, it can actually really help. I think it can help you as a pastor to think, you know what? The problem why people aren't getting my sermon might be me. It might be the fact that I bought into this way of doing sermons, and I should change that. It might be that we're dealing with a population, as Paul says, that's still on milk when they should be on meat. Yeah. Right. And so you think about it on these three levels, and then let's go then to the opening ceremonies. Clearly the producer had an agenda,
right?
Not a clear thinker about the history of Western civilization, much less what the French Revolution was, And he's willing to say, it doesn't matter about communication, only matters what expression is. And here's how I wish the story went. So I'm going to tell the story that way. To your point earlier, this was just boring.
Yeah.
It's the same old, same old. There was nothing really new. It was decadent in the communication. And then you have people that come at it from different, perspectives. And so I think that really, it helps explain. I think it's a device that Christians can use to think about all forms of communication, which of course so much of culture is, whether we're talking about artistic communication or journalism, news, podcasts, whatever else.
I think that's such a helpful framework. I was just listening to a podcast the other day of these two journalists talking about, what is our responsibility when we're publishing a story? Because remember, during Trump's presidency, and I'm sure this will happen again, whenever he spoke, every journalist that covered him in the mainstream media would spend a paragraph after reporting what he said, describing to you why they believe what he said was false. And they would say these widely discredited, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And they were debating, like, how helpful is that? What is our responsibility in terms of doing that? And one of the things that struck me was that somewhere along the way in the past couple years, I think this has been fairly recent, a lot of journalists have decided that their responsibility is not simply to report what was said, but to tell you whether or not it was true, to situate themselves as the arbiters of what you should then think about what they said, which really paralyzes their job. And this is why you get a lot of things going unreported and then things being overreported or misrepresented, because the service then is not like the intent, the point is not to tell you what happened and then allow you to draw your own conclusions. It's to make sure you understand the world in a certain way, and it's the way that's arbitrated by them. But this goes exactly to the intent of art. So your friend read Nietzsche in his devotionals. I found it was an extremely powerful experience when I read David Foster Wallace. Okay, he wrote Infinite Jest, giant novel that was really upsetting in a lot of ways, not at all from a Christian perspective. But what was so profound about that experience for me was that I felt like I was watching a person try to make sense of the world without considering the Christian worldview as a possibility. And I could see how futile that was and how confusing things were that do not need to be confusing. And it honestly made me, it made Christianity look all the more beautiful to me, because I'm watching this story unfold thinking, look at all this needless pain and confusion. If they would just consider, even as a remote possibility, that the truth claims of Christianity might be true, they wouldn't have this question or that problem or that problem. And that was a super powerful experience. But that again goes to what you're saying. It depends on, what your knowledge is, what the intent of the person was. David Foster Wallace clearly did not write that book intending chiefly to make fun of Christianity, which that would have made it a different book and probably a much more boring one. But that is a really cool way to think through kind of what media we allow ourselves to ingest, and at what times and for what purposes.
Right. And it goes back to the earlier question, which is, should we watch this creepy stuff?
Right.
And again, it goes to the intent. It goes to then the moral formation that we have in our discernment too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's neat. So John, really quickly, because we've kind of, this is the Olympics show. I do want to talk just briefly about the situation at the Olympics in the women's boxing. This is a fascinating issue. And it's fascinating on a lot of different levels, but chiefly because for me, I spent a lot of time trying to determine what the actual details of the story are. And frankly, it's still kind of fuzzy to me. But,
it is still fuzzy. And that's an important thing to start with.
Yeah.
The story was, quickly, I think, advanced as if this was a man who identifies as a woman who is allowed to box
against
in
the women's,
and a woman,
and so it's
who got hit within 40 seconds, quit and cried and all of that. Yeah. And some of those elements are true, except we're not talking about a man who identifies this isn't a trans story. This isn't a story about a trans man and the way that transgender is used.
So what I will say is the transgenderism, though, and the way we talk about it and are supposed to talk about it, in air quotes, is what has made this story so confusing. Because I can't tell whether people are saying something that's objectively true or whether they're describing the situation in the way that they feel they're supposed to. So,
well, and that's the subtext though, right? Because, and I think this is really important, is that you have people looking at this. This goes back to our communication. They're looking at the details of the story as if this way of talking about men and women using the language of gender is legitimate.
Yeah.
What happened is, as far as we can tell, is that this person was born and has how do we want to describe it?
Okay,
so she was born and she's been a girl her whole life.
Hold on. She has, this person has XY chromosomes. When I saw this,
didn't know this.
When I saw this described everywhere, and I'm trying to decipher what's happening, I finally find a bunch of stories saying, like in the 6th or 7th paragraph, this person has XY chromosomes. And my immediate thought is, okay, so we have a name for that, and it's male. It's a male.
Right.
That's what we call that. And so then that's when I'm rolling my eyes. I'm getting so frustrated. Okay, so this is why nobody's talking openly about what's happening here. But this is a more unique situation than that. So this person has a condition that I don't even know what it's called, but the testosterone levels are lower than the normal threshold. And I think I don't mean to be graphic, but I think the person's, let's say, secondary sex characteristics are ambiguous, right? So that there's some kind of situation. And I think, as you said, this person is from Turkey, I think, and they did not know.
No, it's not Turkey, but it's in a country where they don't have this
Algeria.
Stuff. Algeria. Yeah. No. Yeah, you're right. And I think when the child was born, I'm not even sure the secondary sex characteristics were ambiguous as well. This is kind of that intersex condition. The child's body has female genitalia.
Okay.
But there is, in terms of, I'm sure it was somewhat ambiguous, but there was just no sense in which this is just like, parents wanting this boy to be a girl, or a doctor, basically just willy-nilly assigning sex, or this, child hitting puberty and going, I was born into the wrong body. From the very beginning, the doctor said it's a girl, raised as a girl. And then basically when a chromosome test is done, it's clear that there is a word for this. It's male. And this is this is the scientific sort of side of this, not the cultural side of this, because that cultural side of this doesn't exist in Algeria. And the World Boxing Federation, in kind of regulating health. So in the same way, they don't let, boxers that weigh way more than other boxers fight each other. Right? You don't do that. You don't let men and women box each other in this. It's been done a couple times and it's been absolutely devastating for women. Mm-hmm. And based on that chromosome test, because what matters here is the body, what matters here is the physical characteristics that emerge from the truth about who this person is biologically. This person was not allowed to box, mm-hmm. but the Olympic Federation was not allowed to box against women, but the Olympic Federation chose differently. Now, look, for this boxer, it's devastating. In other words, this wasn't I'm a man who wants to identify as a woman out of some sexual fetish or wanting to beat up a woman or anything like that. And that's the way the story was kind of sent around, mm-hmm. and it doesn't seem to reflect what the details actually are. I mean, imagine kind of as a girl, you could relate to this much better, than I am. You are born a girl, raised a girl, called a girl, treated like a girl. And then when you're 11 or 12 or 13 or however old this boxer was when they found out about this, you're actually you actually have an XY chromosome. I mean, that would be devastating.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very sad thing for this particular person. It's also a sad thing for this boxer, the other boxer, her opponent or his opponent, this one is hard. A confusing situation.
But I think the salient thing for us, from a communication perspective and a worldview perspective, I agree with you, it's sad all around, is that one of the reasons this story is so difficult to understand and why it's been so confusing, even at the level of the people in charge of the Olympic Committee or whatever, is because of the way we've muddled the issue with the way we talk about gender. Because the first thing the International Olympic Committee said when this, when the boxer from Italy, conceded the match or whatever they call it and said, this is unfair. I've never been hit that hard in my life and that kind of thing. One of the first things they said was, we do not do gender testing at the Olympic Committee because we find that to be, offensive or harmful to people or whatever it is. And that is, like, make no mistake about it, that is a result of the cultural moment that we're in the West, not even
I'm calling it gender testing. It's not gender testing.
And
you're testing chromosomes. You're testing biology. This isn't about gender.
Not just chromosomes either. So this is why this boxer from Algeria had not been able to compete against women in the past.
Because of the testosterone levels.
Because of the testosterone levels. So they test that because you can take, obviously, artificial testosterone, and then it's like doping, right? So they tested this boxer. They said, your testosterone's too high, and they didn't let her compete. It's a really, again, sad situation, but we've needlessly made it more complex and confusing because we don't know how to talk about gender.
Right. Well, and an example of this, right, is when people say, you want to prohibit trans athletes from competing. Nobody cares about that, right? Because no one is telling Brittany Griner that she can't compete in the WNBA. Now, I think some people have asked questions given like her physique and some of the videos that she puts out and that sort of stuff. But no one is telling a woman who identifies as a man that they can't compete in women's sports, right? So transgender, but still competing. We don't want males competing against women.
Yeah.
And that's where, kind of the gotcha on the other side on this is like, oh, this wasn't a trans athlete. This wasn't a trans athlete. No one cares. That's not what this is about. No one cares whether this boxer on the way to the ring wears frilly stuff or masculine stuff. No one cares. This is about men competing against women, and the very real aspects of what it means to be male and female are all these biological realities fundamentally. And even when you have a situation like this, that's not kind of hyper loaded with all of the gender confusion nonsense of the West, it becomes clear, hey, it makes a difference.
Yeah.
Now, whether the rules should be the way they are, whether the rules should be different, whether the Olympic Committee got it wrong or the Boxing Commission got it wrong or they both got it wrong, I don't know enough about that to speak. But what's being underscored in this whole story is that men shouldn't box against women. I'm going to take it further, and you're going to get mad at me, maybe. I don't know.
You're going to say women shouldn't box?
Women shouldn't be boxing.
Oh, interesting.
Because there's a difference between men and women.
I got to think about that.
I think an argument can be made whether men should be boxing, but that's another point.
If men want to knock each other out, I'm totally fine with that. But I got to think about the women thing.
I'm thinking about it theologically, but no, I think Lewis's point in one of the Narnia books that he makes really quickly, that it's a bad thing when women go to combat. It tells you something about the moment, that things have broken. And I think that celebrating women in a boxing situation is a fundamental misconstrual of the realities that are the subtext of this whole story to begin with. I just think it's acting as if there's not a difference between men and women in a whole new way, in a way that it's not the same, with basketball or with soccer or with, I don't know, even like a skill-based combat thing like fencing, or just the pure skill of shooting. I just think boxing communicates something completely different. And, then people are going to write in and go, well, what about judo and taekwondo and all that? I don't know. I'm just saying I can look at this, and say, this is not the mark of an advanced civilization.
Okay. Gosh, I'll have to think about that. I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about it from that perspective, but I'm open.
Clearly, men should not be boxing women, but I'm going to say women shouldn't be boxing.
Here's what I'll say, though. I do disagree with you about and I know you weren't saying this personally, but I really hate engaging in the sort of like, oh, that, Brittany Griner, that person looks like they might be, we shouldn't do that. That's just, That is hurtful all across the board. We do not need to look at people's physiques and make assumptions or suggest that they're hiding something. Like, I think that can go bad really fast. But it is a good point that I hate that language too. And people employ that when we're talking about restrooms, where they're like, well, where is a trans person supposed to use the restroom? The restroom. They're supposed to use the restroom like we all use the restroom. And nobody is barring them entry from anything. And so your point is well taken. But okay, John, let's talk about recommendations. You recommended earlier something. What was it? Oh, the Jonathan Pageau.
Yeah. He's a fascinating artist. Again, he's Orthodox and an iconographer. So he's doing sacred art, but he also, I think, has a pretty deep well when it comes to understanding art theologically. And I really think that it's a profound analysis that he did on his YouTube channel. We'll link to it in our show notes, but you can pretty much find it if you type in Google Jonathan Pageau, Pageau, I think is how you spell it, and Olympic ceremony or something like that. And it was, 15, 20 minutes, well worth your time to kind of walk through, the whole thing. Because all of these things were historically loaded. All the references were, the entire intent of the whole thing is, what the opening ceremonies has become. I mentioned the Beijing games and, kind of the propaganda, that machine that was. This is nothing new, by the way. Hitler did the same thing in Germany, right? Remember that? All the flags were down, all the anti-Jewish stuff was taken down, and, an attempt to show the, Aryan supremacy in those games. That's the thing about worldview. And that's what I appreciated about his video, is that he is really taking seriously worldview, these fundamental beliefs that we have about life in the world, maybe even if we don't recognize it, that emerge in how we live and in what we create. And if you look at it from that point of view, I would say, look, a lot of folks are going back to school in the next couple of weeks. If you, teach theology, or if you teach, Bible, or if you are, teach art, you have something very, very, very powerful. To high schoolers, obviously, you don't want to show the opening ceremonies to anybody else. But, if they saw it, and if this is something worth discussing, and I think you can discuss it without actually showing clips of it. And isn't it crazy to say you shouldn't show clips of the opening ceremonies of the Olympics to your students?
I feel bad for the athletes.
It's such a degradation, And by the way, the other thing, I know we've already taken this beyond what we should, but I've been thinking about this so much. I thought that the opening ceremonies was, again, supported the thesis of Carl Trueman. We talked about this weeks ago, where, the modern world is a disenchanted world, where you basically take any sort of vertical reference and make it all horizontal. And he argued that disenchantment leads to desecration, and that there has to be an intentional desecration. And, I appreciated that he wrote his First Things piece this week, and he wrote his World piece this week, and didn't say, I told you so, because he could have, because that's exactly such an example of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm going to do typical Maria and recommend a couple things, but pretend it's just one. So first of all, really quickly, read the novel Madame Tussaud by Michel Moran, because it is a telling of the French Revolution through the eyes of the Tussaud family, which, speaking of art as communication, they really rose to prominence, this family, because people in that era did not know what nobility looked like, or what different famous people looked like. So Madame Tussaud, this woman and her family, got very skilled at creating likenesses of the king and queen and others out of wax figures. And during the revolution, they became sort of a news outlet. People would show up at their museum to see depictions in wax of what was happening. But it is a really, really well-written novel, and a really eye-opening look into how the French Revolution went down. And it was not a moment of pride for that country. But really quickly, I just have to tell you, I'm coming at you this week from Iowa. I'm at Village Creek Bible Camp, We have had just the sweetest, coolest week with our girls. This is a family camp week. They do all kinds of different camps here. But so we're here with our 2 daughters, and our friends from Phoenix are here, including our pastor from our church in Phoenix who's been teaching at chapel. And this is the kind of place where we wake up in the morning and our daughters just disappear. And they're all day with their friends in the creek and swimming in the lake and doing all kinds of summery camp things. There is no internet here. I had to get special permission to record this podcast. So they've never even asked for TV or internet or devices or anything. And it's just beautiful here, and it's clearly just a really special place. And actually, I met another family who the mom and dad just became commissioned as Colson Fellows this past at the conference a couple months ago. So that's awesome. So if you're looking for a place to go with your kiddos or to have just a really restful week in the summer, check out Village Creek Bible Camp. Shout out. Well, John, that's going to do it for our show today. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stonestreet. Thanks for listening. Like John mentioned, you can find links to the stories we talked about today and our recommendations and other things at breakpoint.org. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week. Have a good one.